The carriage wheels found every cobblestone on the approach to Ashworth House, and Cecily felt each one through the thin soles of her black kid slippers. She had not eaten since the night before. She had not needed to. The account book sat on her lap, its worn leather cover smooth under her gloved fingers, and she did not open it. She had not needed to open it. In 3 weeks. Through the black silk veil, the house resolved from gray morning into something sharper. Its Georgian facade unchanged from the day she had first arrived in Edmund's carriage as his wife. The red brick darkened by January rain, the windows blank and watchful. 8 men waited inside. 8 men who had spent 14 months constructing a version of Cecily Ashworth that could be swept aside with a signature and a notarized seal. She breathed in. She breathed out. The smile was present. It had been present since she woke at 5:30 and dressed in the dark and checked the letter one final time before folding it back into the account book's front cover, where she had kept it for 6 weeks. It was not a smile of triumph. It was not a smile of vindication. It was the smile of a woman who has done arithmetic that no one else has thought to do, and who has arrived at a sum that changes everything, and who has had the considerable patience to wait until this particular morning to show her work. She had not always known she was going to win. There had been a night, 3 weeks prior, when she had sat in her lodgings in Bury Street with the account book spread open, and the fire gone to ash, and the conviction that she had missed something she could not name, and the quiet had been the longest quiet of her life. The morning came, as mornings do, and she had found what she had missed. And it was not a small thing to have found. The carriage came to a stop. The footman opened the door. Cecily smoothed her black crepe skirt, tucked the account book under her arm, and descended with the care of a woman who has learned to move precisely in a world that is watching for any stumble it can name a failing. If there are stories that begin with a woman underestimated, you know already how they tend to end. Stay with this one, because the path is not the one they planned for her. 14 months earlier, in the drawing room of a solicitor's office in Holborn, a will had been read aloud in the presence of the Ashworth family, and Edmund Ashworth's bequest to his wife had landed in that room like a stone dropped through silk. £3,000 annually from the Ashworth revenues for the duration of her natural life and the right of residency in the dower house at Ashworth Park for a period not less than 10 years. Edmund had dictated it himself in the final weeks of his illness, and it had been witnessed and filed with the appropriate parties, and it was perfectly legal. Philip Ashworth had not said a word in the room. He had waited, and his silence had been more dangerous than speech. Edmund and Philip had never been close. Edmund was the younger brother, the one who had read law at Oxford and let the practice lapse in favor of a life of quiet scholarship and estate management from a respectful distance, the one who had married late and unexpectedly and died before the marriage was 3 years old. Philip was the one who had managed Ashworth Park's revenues since their father's death, who had installed himself in the principal rooms while Edmund occupied the north wing, who had developed very clear ideas about what the estate owed him and what it did not owe a woman who had appeared from a family of modest Wiltshire gentry and caught Edmund Ashworth's attention at a musicale in the spring of 1813. The objection Philip brought was formal and precise. Undue influence. It was not an accusation of fraud. It was not an accusation of anything so crude. It was the suggestion made in polished solicitor's language that a young woman of limited fortune and considerable intelligence had positioned herself advantageously near a man of failing health and had shaped his decisions in the final period of his mental and physical decline. The suggestion did not need to be true. It only needed to be plausible. And in a world that had already decided what Cecily was, plausible was not difficult to achieve. The label arrived within the month. She heard it first from Lady Dolores Fane, at a morning call to which Cecily had been invited out of form and not warmth, where Lady Dolores had been speaking to her companion, Miss Burrell, in the half-voice that is not quite private and not quite intended to be. "The scheming widow, they call her," Lady Dolores had said, examining the handle of her teacup with studied attention. "And I cannot say it is unkind." Cecily had not moved. She had set her own teacup down with great care on its saucer, and she had said something courteous about the weather, and she had left at the appropriate interval, and she had walked the 3 streets back to her lodgings in Bury Street, with her gloved hands very still at her sides and the account book which she carried everywhere by then, pressed against her ribs. The account book had been Edmund's gift to her in the 3rd week of their marriage. He had come into the study where she was going over the household figures with the housekeeper, and had watched her for a long moment from the doorway, and then he had brought the small leather-bound book down from the shelf and handed it to her without preamble. "Your figures are better than mine," he had said simply. They always were. It was not a romantic declaration. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, and she had loved him for it then, and she loved him for it still. She did not speak of that love. There was no one to speak of it to, and speaking of it would have read as performance, and she was not a woman who performed. She carried it the way she carried the account book, close and without display. By August, 4 months after the will's reading, Philip had engaged Mr. Hartwell of the firm Hartwell & Grays to construct the formal contest. Hartwell was 60 years old, dry-voiced, and had won 3 previous estate contests by the application of patient procedural attrition. His method was not dramatic. It was thorough. He filed motions and counter-motions, requested extensions, buried the opposing counsel in correspondence, and waited for the woman on the other side of the table to run out of money or nerve, whichever came first. Cecily's own solicitor, Mr. Baines, was a decent man of moderate skill, who had advised Edmund on several smaller matters and who was thoroughly outmatched. She knew it, and he knew it, and they did not discuss it, because there was nothing practical to be done about the knowledge. What changed was Halcombe. The Marquess of Halcombe had been Edmund's friend from their Oxford days. Not a close friend, not the kind of friend one sees regularly in London, but the kind one writes to 3 times a year on subjects of mutual intellectual interest, and whose death one marks with genuine grief rather than social performance. He had attended the funeral. Cecily had registered him at the graveside, tall and very still and dark-coated against the November sky, and they had exchanged the brief necessary words of the occasion, and she had not expected to encounter him again. She encountered him in October, at a dinner at the house of the Honorable Mr. and Mrs. Seton, where mutual connection had assembled 8 people at a table, and the seating arrangement had placed him 3 chairs away from her, close enough for direct conversation when the table's general discourse paused. He had said almost nothing through the soup. He had observed everything. Over the fish, he said, his voice measured, "How does the contest proceed, Mrs. Ashworth?" She had looked at him with the particular assessment she gave to every question, whose source she had not yet gauged. And she said slowly, "My lord, as these matters tend to." "Hartwell is a methodical man," Halcombe said. He was looking not at her, but at a point slightly beyond the centerpiece, and the effect was of a man thinking rather than speaking. "He has won 3 cases by attrition. He will assume you have neither the resources nor the endurance for a long contest." "He would be partly correct," Cecily said. He looked at her then directly and without the social softening that most men employed. When they looked at a woman of uncertain position, the dark brown eyes were still, the way deep water is still without being empty. He said nothing for a moment. "Edmund spoke of your mind," he said. More than once, she did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing, and the table's conversation resumed, and that was the end of it. But 2 days later a note arrived through Mr. Baines from a third party Cecily did not recognize, and inside was a single line in a hand she had not seen before. "Do not sign anything before Thursday. Halcombe." She had sat with the note for a considerable time. He appeared again at the Seton drawing-room the following Thursday, a musical evening to which she had been invited, with the same mixture of sympathy and curiosity that colored most of her social invitations that autumn. And this time he sat beside her during the interval, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the chill of the room. And he spoke quietly and without looking at her, in the way of a man who has learned to conduct important conversations without the room observing that he is doing so. "There is a letter," he said. "Edmund wrote to a man named Cranley 6 weeks before he died. Not his solicitor. Cranley is a retired arbitrator from the Court of Chancery. He has spent 20 years reviewing cases of contested bequests. Edmund asked his opinion of the will's structure and whether it would bear a challenge. Cranley's response was that it would, and he committed that opinion in writing and kept a copy. She did not move. She said, her voice even, "Where is this letter?" Edmund kept the original. It should be in the estate's correspondence files. Philip controls those files. Yes, he said. He turned his head slightly, not enough to catch the room's attention, but enough that she could see the line of his jaw in profile. But Cranley kept his copy. She understood then the full architecture of what he was offering, not rescue. Evidence. The distinction was everything. She did not say thank you. She said, "Will Cranley attend if I ask him?" Halcombe said, "He has a long memory for cases of this kind, and a strong objection to watching the same mechanism operate twice." She thought of Clara Vane, though she did not know Clara's name yet. She thought of whatever had produced that objection, that particular and personal distaste for watching the mechanism operate twice. She filed it, without speaking of it. "Then ask him," she said. He stood. He excused himself from her vicinity, with the formal precision of a man who has been raised to give nothing away in company. She watched him cross the room, and understood, in the particular bodily way that has nothing to do with reason, that something had shifted in the geometry of her situation. It was here, in the weeks between that evening and the morning of the meeting, that Cecily went to the Ashworth Library. She had a right of access to the house until the contest was resolved, and that much Philip could not prevent without making his interference visible to the court. She exercised that right in the early morning, 3 weeks before the formal table meeting Philip had called, arriving by hired carriage at 6:30, and letting herself in through the east door with the key she had never surrendered. The estate's correspondence files were housed in the library's locked cabinet, and she had the key to that as well, because Edmund had given it to her, and Philip did not know he had done so. She worked for 2 hours by the pale January light, and 2 candles she had brought herself, cross-referencing the account book's figures against the estate's own ledgers, building the numerical argument that Philip's claim of her undue influence could not survive if the estate's actual financial history was made plain. Edmund had managed the Ashworth revenues with careful and meticulous attention for 12 years before she married him. The accounts showed it. Every figure she had already committed to memory she now confirmed against the source. She did not hear the door. The library in the early morning was the quietest room in a quiet house, and she had been working in it for nearly 2 hours. And the work had its own sound, the soft turn of ledger pages and the light scratch of her pencil, and the occasional small adjustment of the account book's spine against the desk's surface. She was aware of these sounds. She was not aware of anything else. She became aware of him the way one becomes aware of a change in air pressure, a slight shift, a quality of attended silence that differed from the silence she had been working in. She looked up. Halcombe stood in the doorway, one hand at the frame, coat still wearing the cold of the morning outside. He had come, she would learn later, for a letter Edmund had sent him regarding a different matter, which he had reason to believe was filed in the same cabinet. He had not expected to find her. He did not speak. He looked at the spread of the account book, the open ledger beside it, the 2 candles, the set of her shoulders, the line of her profile bent over the page. He looked for what she would later count as 4 full minutes. Though she did not look back, she heard him breathe, once a slow, measured breath, and then she heard him leave. When she finished and gathered her things and went to extinguish the candles, she found his card on the mantelpiece. He had placed it there at some point during those 4 minutes, and she had not heard him cross the room to do it. She stood with the card in her gloved hand for rather longer than she intended. If you have been following her this far, you know what she felt even if she would not have named it yet. It is enough, for now come back to her at the table. 3 days before the morning meeting, the dark arrived the way. Dark tends to, not as a single blow, but as an accumulation of small failures whose sum is suddenly visible. Mr. Baines came to her in Bury Street, with the expression of a man delivering news he has already apologized for in his own mind, and he told her that Philip had secured an additional affidavit. A housemaid named Meg, who had been in service at Ashworth Park during Edmund's final illness, had made a signed statement that she had observed Cecily reading correspondence to Edmund during his periods of weakness, including correspondence that may have pertained to the will. The affidavit did not accuse Cecily directly. It did not need to. It created doubt, and doubt was Hartwell's medium. Baines also told her with the careful neutrality of a man relaying something painful, that Hartwell had spoken the label openly in a meeting with a junior counsel from another firm. The junior counsel had a loose mouth, and the phrase had traveled. One of the other men who would be present at the table meeting had apparently already heard it and had expressed no objection to it. The scheming widow brought nothing to the marriage, Baines said, reading from his notes with the detachment of a man who does not know how the words will land, and takes nothing out. Cecily sat with that for a moment. She held the account book in her lap. She looked at the fire. The problem with the affidavit was that it was not entirely untrue. She had read correspondence to Edmund in his final months, because his eyes had weakened and he had asked her to. She had read all manner of correspondence, including letters from the solicitors, and she had rendered opinions when he asked for them, and he had sometimes followed those opinions and sometimes had not, as a man of his own mind was entitled to do. None of that was influence. All of it was care. The distinction was real and the law was imprecise, and she knew that Hartwell knew that, and that was the point. She sat with the account book until the fire burned down. She did not cry. She had not cried since Edmund's funeral, where she had stood beside Philip and his wife in the cold November churchyard, and received condolences from people who had known Edmund for 30 years, and who looked at her with a kind of careful blankness that she understood. She had been a wife for 3 years. She was not yet 30. The coldness of the churchyard was a thing she still felt when she was tired. The gray light and the bare November branches and the distance between herself and everyone else in the frame. Then she opened it to the front cover and took out the letter. It was not Edmund's letter to Cranley, which she had never seen. It was Cranley's response which Halcombe had sent to her 3 weeks earlier via a sealed packet through Baines. She had read it 4 times. She had committed it to memory. She had placed it in the account book because that was where things she needed to carry close belonged. She read it one final time in the dying firelight. Cranley's hand was precise and old-fashioned, the letters very upright, the sentences economical. He stated clearly that in his professional judgment, the Ashworth will was a document made by a man of sound mind, exercising clear volition, that the bequest to Mrs. Ashworth reflected long-standing expressed intention and not any late coercion, and that he was prepared to state this before any party or arbitrating body that required it. She put the letter back in the account book. She allowed herself, in the privacy of the empty room, a single moment of grief for Edmund, who would have found the whole business both outrageous and faintly amusing, who had always said that Philip's confidence exceeded his competence, who had said on more than one occasion that Cecily's judgment was one of the most reliable things he had encountered in 62 years of encountering things. She missed him the way she had always loved him, quietly, specifically, and without performance. Then she blew out the candle, went to bed, and slept soundly until 5:30. Ashworth House, on the morning of the meeting, wore the particular severity of a Georgian interior in January, when the light is flat and the fires have been lit but have not yet warmed the rooms to any feeling of welcome. The footman who received Cecily in the entrance hall looked past her in the way of servants whose instructions are to be polite but not warm. She did not need warmth. Philip's study had been rearranged for the occasion. The usual desk had been supplemented by a long mahogany table brought in from the dining room, and around it sat 7 men. Philip himself occupied the head, florid, and composed in the manner of a man who has won before and expects to win again. Hartwell sat at his right, dry and meticulous, a stack of papers before him. 2 junior solicitors from his firm were arranged like architectural elements. A man from the Ashworth banking concern, whom Cecily recognized by description but had not met, sat beside them. Then one of Philip's cousins, included presumably for family weight, and at the far end a man from the county records office, present to receive whatever document would be produced and stamped in the course of the morning. Cecily was shown to a chair on the table's left side, facing Hartwell, with a low window behind her that put her in shadow and everyone else in what light there was. She had not doubted that this would be the arrangement. She had dressed accordingly, in the plainest of her morning gowns, the veil drawn. She placed the account book on the table before her with the care of a woman setting down something she intends to pick up again. Philip looked at the account book. He looked away. The 8th chair, she noted, was empty. Philip opened the proceedings with the polished ease of a man addressing a room he expects to agree with him. He spoke of Edmund's final years, of the vulnerabilities of advancing age and failing health, of the natural desire of a family to protect its patrimony from decisions made in conditions of weakness. He spoke with genuine emotion. She thought he had loved Edmund in his way, the way men love brothers from whom they have always expected something and have always been mildly disappointed. She did not hold it against him. She held against him the 14 months of the campaign, the coached housemaid, the phrase made public in solicitors' offices. Hartwell then presented the formal papers. His voice was the voice of a procedure made human, colorless, exact, without affect. He outlined the grounds of the contest, cited the affidavit, named 3 precedents from Chancery, and concluded by indicating that a document, Ashworth's signature, a deed of surrender for the annual bequest, and the right of residency, in exchange for a one-time settlement of £200, and the family's agreement not to pursue further action against her interest. £200. Philip had never met a woman he thought could count. Hartwell placed the document in front of her. She did not touch it. The door opened. Halcombe came in without announcing himself, which was the prerogative of a marquess and also of a man who has decided he is done with preliminary social arrangements. Behind him came an older man of 70 or so, upright and spare, with the face of someone accustomed to examining things at close range and finding them either sound or wanting. This was Thomas Cranley, and every man at that table who knew the name registered it in a different way. Philip's composure slipped by a fraction. Hartwell went very still. Halcombe took the empty chair. Cranley placed himself beside him and set a leather satchel on the table and did not introduce himself because the room already knew. Philip said with recovered smoothness, "My lord, I was not informed that this meeting was to include additional parties." "No," Halcombe said. He did not elaborate. Philip turned to Cecily. His tone shifted into the register of finality. "Mrs. Ashworth, I believe the papers require only your signature to conclude the matter, and allow all parties to move forward," she said. "I do not intend to sign them." The room produced the particular quality of silence that belongs to a moment when 8 men realize simultaneously that the woman they brought to the table as a formality has come to it as something else entirely. Philip said, with great care, "My brother's scheming widow is welcome to contest the terms, of course, though I would encourage her to consider the costs of continued proceedings." Halcombe said, "She will not sign it, and neither will the arbitrator." 12 words spoken in a voice that did not rise or harden, a voice as level as a ruled line on paper. The room heard them the way rooms hear irrevocable things. Cranley opened the leather satchel. He placed a letter on the table, and then beside it, a second document in his own hand. And he said, addressing the table with the mild authority of a man who has spent 20 years in service to the Court of Chancery and does not require anyone's cooperation to proceed, "I have been asked to attend this meeting in my capacity as private arbitrator and former officer of the court. I hold correspondence from the late Mr. Tant, Edmund Ashworth, dated September the 4th of 1814, 3 weeks before his death. I also hold my own response, which reflects my professional assessment of the will's validity. I am prepared to read both documents into the record, and I would suggest that the county records officer prepare to note their contents." Cecily opened the account book. She drew out Cranley's letter and placed it on the table beside her own copy. She did not speak. She did not need to. What followed was not a scene of dramatic collapse. Philip was a careful man, and careful men do not collapse dramatically. What happened instead was a series of precise and quietly devastating recognitions. Cranley read the documents. The county records officer took his notes. Hartwell examined Edmund's letter with the expression of a man locating the exact point at which his case has met its structural failure. The housemaid's affidavit, which had been designed to create doubt about the will's circumstances, was rendered beside the point the moment Edmund's own communication to an arbitrator established that the will's terms had been set and confirmed 3 weeks before his death. In a letter that mentioned no one's influence and cited only his own settled determination. When Cranley had finished, there was a silence of perhaps 30 seconds. Philip looked at the middle distance. The florid color had not left his face, but it had changed character into something less certain, no longer the color of confidence. One of the junior solicitors leaned toward Hartwell and said something low. Hartwell did not respond. It was Cecily who spoke. She said in the same even tone she had used throughout, "I should like the deed of surrender returned to the Hartwell firm's possession, as it no longer pertains to the matter before us. I should also like the estate's correspondence files made available to my solicitor, Mr. Baines, in the matter of the annual bequest's proper administration going forward." She paused. "I have no other requests at this time, my." Philip looked at her. There was a long moment in which she held his gaze without animosity and without triumph, because neither was called for. He had built his case on a reading of his brother's widow that was simply, factually wrong, and now he knew it, and the knowing was sufficient. He said, "Very well." It was not gracious. It was honest, which was, perhaps, more than she had expected. The withdrawing room adjacent to the study, where Lady Dolores Fane had been received earlier that morning to wait for Philip's anticipated news of the meeting's conclusion. The sounds of the room carried with sufficient clarity for a woman of Lady Dolores's attentiveness to follow the broad architecture of what had occurred. She sat with her teacup held at a stopped angle, and her expression cycling through surprise into a more complicated arrangement. When Cecily passed through the withdrawing room on her way to the entrance hall, their eyes met for a fraction of a moment. Lady Dolores said, "Mrs. Ashworth, not warmly? Not coldly, with the particular care of a woman recalibrating." "Cecily," said Lady Dolores, "with the same care." She descended the steps of Ashworth House into the January afternoon, and the veil was still drawn, and the account book was under her arm, and the smile that had been present since 5:30 that morning was now something else, something quieter and less contained, though no one on the street could have seen it. She had not reached the carriage when she heard his step behind her. Halcombe came down the steps at his own pace, unhurried, and fell into step beside her on the pavement, without asking whether she wished him to. This was characteristic of him. She had learned he did not ask. He arrived. They walked a short distance in silence. The January air was still. A thin precipitation had begun that could not quite decide whether to be rain or something colder. "The housemaid," she said. "Baines will deal with it," he said. The affidavit's probative value is effectively nil beside Cranley's documents. Hartwell knows it. "How did you know about Cranley's letter?" He was quiet for 2 steps. "Edmund told me last summer. He wrote that he had consulted Cranley about the will and that Cranley had been encouraging. He said he thought it would be sufficient." A pause. "He mentioned he had told you the will was sound and that you had not entirely believed him." She thought of Edmund's voice. Dry and fond. Always the skeptic Cecily. And she smiled at the thought. She felt the grief of it move through her chest and out the other side, the way grief does when it has been carried honestly for long enough. "I believed him," she said. "I wanted the corroborating evidence." "Yes," Halcombe said. Something in his voice shifted. The faintest thaw, the almost amusement she had learned to detect at considerable cost of attention. "Edmund said that as well." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her, and they stood on the pavement with the thin precipitation settling over them, and neither speaking for a moment. She said, "Your sister." The word landed quietly, without accusation, and he received it the same way. He did not ask how she had come to know. He said, "Clara. She lives in Bath." "She does." He looked at the gray street. His jaw held its slight asymmetry against the winter light, the left side higher than the right, and his hands were very still at his sides, in the way of a man who has learned to contain things in the same school she had attended. The contest that overturned her husband's bequest was brought by Thomas Renfield. He engaged Hartwell. "The same firm," Cecily said. "The same firm." A pause, the length of a drawn breath. Clara had no counsel of her own. She trusted the process, and the process had been arranged by the people who wished to deprive her of everything her husband had left her. It took 11 months. By the time I understood what was happening, the decision had been entered. His voice did not change in volume or register. It was the voice of a man stating a fact, which was the only way he knew to state things that cost him. I was too late to be of use. She listened to this without speaking. She understood the shape of what it was to have done the right thing badly, to have seen with full clarity, after the moment in which clarity was useful. She had not known that. She had known about Clara, had known the bare shape of the loss, but she had not known that Hartwell's name appeared in that history as well. She understood now the texture of his objection, the source of the particular quality of his attention. When she had told him she thought her own solicitor was outmatched, it had not been pity. It had been recognition. "You lost time," she said. Trusting the system, he turned his head and looked at her, and his face was entirely without defense, in the way of men who have gone past the point where defense is useful. Yes. She did not tell him she was sorry, because he had not come to her as a man who wanted condolence. She said instead, "Will you take tea?" He looked at her for a long moment. The precipitation had shifted towards snow, now, soft and very light, settling on the shoulders of his coat and on the veil and on the account book's worn leather cover. He said, "Yes." They took tea in a small establishment near Jermyn Street that was warm and plain and asked nothing of either of them in the way of social presentation. A fire burned at the far end of the room. They sat across from each other, and she removed the veil, which she had not done publicly in 14 months, and set it on the bench beside her like a flag lowered at the end of a campaign. She was aware of the slight shock of it on his face, the gray-green eyes, and the freckles across the nose, and the small mouth with its firm set, and she did not account for the shock, because she did not need to. They talked about Edmund. She had not talked about Edmund since his death, not honestly, not with anyone who had known him well enough to contribute to the conversation, rather than simply receive it. She told Halcombe about the account book and how it had come to be hers. He told her about a letter Edmund had written him once in 1811, about the difference between intelligence and judgment, which was one of Edmund's preferred distinctions, and she laughed at the way Halcombe described it. Not a large laugh, but a real one, brief and genuine. The fire was a steady, warm presence at the edge of the afternoon. At some point, Halcombe reached across the table, not quickly, not with any dramatic intention, and placed his hand over hers, where it rested beside the account book. Just the pressure of it. The weight of a hand that has decided to be there. She looked at his hand, and then at his face, and what she read there was not duty, and not pity, and not the strategic generosity of a man who has done her a service and expects its character to be named in a particular way. She turned her hand and let her fingers close over his. They did not speak for a moment. Outside the window, the snow continued to come down, softening the January afternoon into something gentler. A coal shifted in the grate. Someone at the far end of the room played a single figure on the pianoforte and stopped. "Cecily," he said, her given name. He said it the way Edmund had said, that her figures were better than his, simply as a statement of something true and acknowledged, with no performance around it. She did not answer with words. She felt the warmth of his hand in hers, and the weight of the account book on the table between them, and Edmund's quiet, careful love which had produced this account book and this letter, and this morning, and which asked of her now only that she live fully in the life he had arranged for her to live. She had outplanned every man at the table. She had done it with figures and patience and a letter kept in a worn account book, and the help of a man who understood what it cost to trust the wrong machinery at the wrong moment. The veil was on the bench beside her. The smile was no longer hidden. That winter, Halcombe called at Bury Street twice a week, with the regularity and lack of ceremony that became, in time, one of the quiet pleasures of Cecily's days. He never said he was coming. He simply came. He brought no flowers and no poems. And he brought the occasional document of interest, a legal question he wanted her opinion on, and once in March a copy of a letter from Clara in Bath that he placed on the table without comment and allowed her to read while he looked at the garden through the sitting-room window. Clara wrote with a dry intelligence that Cecily recognized immediately, and she said so, and he said, looking at the garden, "She was always the clever one." And then, after a pause, "I may have been wrong about that." The annual bequest from the Ashworth estate was confirmed in February by Cranley's formal arbitration, with no appeal from Philip, who had engaged new counsel and was occupied with the considerable work of revising his assessment of the situation. The dower house at Ashworth Park was available to her in the spring, but Cecily did not move into it. She did not need to move into it. She knew what she was doing. By autumn, she did. On a September morning that held the last warmth of the season, in a particular quality of light that came through the south windows of the dower house, in a long, low gold, Cecily sat at the small writing desk Edmund had left there, the account book open before her, and listened to Halcombe in the next room speaking to the estate's steward about the Eastfields drainage. His voice was the same, regardless of context, level and measured and entirely attentive to the matter before it. She had learned to hear the warmth inside the level, the way you learn to hear music you have been told is not there and then cannot stop hearing. She did not hear the door, but she felt the change in the room's air, and she looked up, and he was standing in the doorway in the same way he had stood in the library doorway on that January dawn, coat carrying the morning on it, hands very still. He looked at her. She looked at him. The account book was open between them, the same worn cover, the same neat columns of figures, the first page still bearing Edmund's note in his careful hand, his familiar letters small and precise. "Your figures are better than mine." Outside the window, the last of the garden's roses held on in the September air, red against the gray stone of the house's wall, in the specific bright way of things that have made it through to the end of their season. Halcombe came into the room. He sat in the chair across the desk, the chair Edmund had occupied when he dictated letters, and she had transcribed them. The chair that still held, in some way, the shape of a man who had loved her well and wisely, and had planned, in his quiet and determined fashion, for her to be exactly here. She closed the account book. She did not need it any more. Everything in it she carried in herself, had carried from the first morning she had opened it, in the years of her marriage, and understood what it was that Edmund had handed her. She set her hand on its cover, and Halcombe set his over hers, and outside the window the light held as long as it could, and held a little longer. "Thank you for staying with Cecily until the end. If her patience and her planning moved you, leave a word in the comments. And there is more waiting for you here."